Hello, and thanks for joining us for week 16 of our podcast, the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We're glad you've joined us. This coming week, we're going to be in Genesis chapters 43, 44, and 45, Psalm chapter 15, and Matthew chapter 15. These chapters are filled with all kinds of amazing stories, amazing things to discuss. We're not going to be able to get to all of it today. There's no way. But we just want to kind of touch on some of the big highlights from these readings. And so I'm glad you've joined us for that. I pray that this time will be fruitful for you and will help you as you read through the scriptures every single day with us in the Well Bible Reading Journey. So let me go ahead and bring in Amber and Craig. Amber and Craig, thanks for joining us today.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So we're discussing today Genesis. We're going to try to focus in on Genesis chapter 45, and then hopefully a little bit of Matthew chapter 15. There's so much in both of these chapters that it's going to be hard, but we're gonna kind of hit it. So Genesis chapter 45, right? It's the big reveal, and in some ways, this story where Joseph now reveals his identity to his brothers. This story has been building and building and building for a number of chapters already. So, what are some of the things that you got from this, Craig? What's maybe a theme or something you saw in this chapter in particular?
Yeah, I found a couple, Ellis. The first was the nature of Joseph's apparent reconciliation with his brothers in verses 1 through 15. I think he generally forgives them here in chapter 45 and sees the hand of God in all that has transpired. But he also seems to still not be quite over the past, over what's happened to him. And he wants to recount and restate everything that's happened to him that's been painful along the way. I kind of wonder if he's perhaps forgiven but not forgotten. I get that, especially compared to chapter 50. We compared what happened in chapter 45 and how the story is recounted with that compared to chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. And I'm looking ahead a little bit, so forgive me for foreshadowing and forward winding. But chapter 50 seems to replicate the events of 45, but with a twist. It's really the sense that Joseph is having to remind his brothers that, yes, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. They want to bow down before him as if he's their Lord, their God. But Joseph reminds him that I'm not God. God is God. I'm not your Lord. God is. So get up, and it's all good. Reading from, just real quickly, Genesis 50, verses 18 through 21. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in place of God?" So finally, the past comes to a place where it is no longer between them. I think this is a great reminder for us, because throughout all of our journeys, reconciliation is not easy, and it's not painless, and it's not quick. You can't short circuit it. You got to honor it and go through the process and grieve.
Yeah, no, that's great. It seems like there's this whole process, and actually starting a number of chapters back, where he first meets his brothers, he first sees his brothers. There's this whole process. You've been waiting for him to reveal himself. We know that he's Joseph. They don't, and it seems like it's been hard for Joseph. Like he hasn't wanted to, right? And so it's this process. Amber, did you get some of that from the story?
Yes, exactly, Ellis. I thought the exact same thing as what you just said. My version uses the word that he could not restrain himself anymore. I know other versions uses things like he could not control himself or refrain. It's almost as if he just had a breakdown, like he just could not hold it in any longer. He's been holding this in. And to go with your point, Craig, the reason I think this is so hard for him is because he's recognizing that God has done something amazing. He's turned something good that was meant for bad, but at the same time, the hurt is still there. He doesn't have to pretend that the hurt is gone. And meanwhile, he's been hanging out with his brothers. His brothers have no idea who he is, and he finally just can't handle it anymore longer. And it's like he's been in this counseling session for all these weeks, and it's like the moment where he just explodes and he just can't do it anymore.
Yeah, and I think we have to see Joseph, and I think that's a great point, Amber, and really see Joseph as someone who has experienced trauma. He has been traumatized, and remember that most of his brothers actually wanted to kill him. I mean, they literally wanted to kill him, and they were going to, and he thought they were going to, but I think it was Reuben and Judah who kind of stopped them and said, "No, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him." Right? Mm-hmm. They were a little bit more level-headed, but he's been traumatized. And then in Potiphar's house, he was traumatized there. thrown into prison. He was trauma. He's experienced tremendous trauma,
That's right.
and you don't just get over that very easily. I mean, that's hard to get past, right? It seems like he's struggling with that.
I think the narrative is clear that he was not getting personal enjoyment out of the deception, out of this waiting. I don't think he was getting anything from it personally. I don't think the narrative shows that. And also, the narrative doesn't really tell us why he did choose to wait so long and he didn't immediately reveal himself to his brothers. We don't really know. I came up with a few maybes.
Mhm.
First of all, maybe the narrative was just following this theme, like we've been seeing throughout Genesis, of families just having this deception and scheming over and over with all these families. And to be honest, I think that's a terrible, weak argument, if I don't say so myself, because I think Joseph this whole time has been this contrasting character. So I don't think that's probably it. So
Mhm.
my other thought was, well, maybe we can conclude that he's just following God's direction because Pharaoh just called him in the last chapter that he had the Spirit of God in him. He's wise enough to have the Spirit of God in him. So was he using that Spirit of God wisdom and just following God's lead here and was not getting any personal enjoyment out of it? Or is it something else? I need someone smarter like Ellis to help me unfold maybe what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's a lot happening, and I think it could be. I think you're right. Joseph is primarily a contrasting character, primarily to his brothers, but to, you could say, also to uh, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the way that they've been living their lives. He has shown at every point this pretty high character. Um, I think that probably the best explanation, though, is that he it's like when you've been traumatized, you've gone through this trauma, and now you've got to confront the ones who traumatized you. So, it's one thing in counseling or whatever to kind of say you forgive the person who traumatized you, and even to get past it, and to move on with your life, and you can do that. But what happens if you're at Kroger or somewhere, and that person who traumatized you shows up? They're there, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I would imagine you have all these feelings that come back up because this is the
sure,
person who traumatized you. So it's
sure.
one thing to say, I forgive it. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to move on. I'm going to get past this. Or God is. I see God's hand in it. I think he was saying all those things. But then it's still. This is a crass kind of example, but it's kind of like throwing up, right? You've got all this toxic stuff inside of you, and I do not like to throw. I'm one of those persons that will do anything not to throw up. I'll sit there in the bed and just hold my breath so that I don't throw up, right? Even though I know that if once I do that, I'll feel better, right? Because I
Mhm.
get all the toxin out of me. I think this is one of those throw up moments for Joseph. He doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to do it, is avoiding it because it's so hard, it's so painful. But no, afterwards he has to feel better, right? Once he's gotten it out, and in the scene where he does it, it's so interesting to me how, number one, the narrator draws it out. That's for dramatic effect. He's making this. He wants us to see this is a high drama moment. This is a tense, intense moment, right? And it's the way it describes it. It sounds to me like Joseph basically has a nervous breakdown.
Breakdown.
I mean, he has to go in a room and he's screaming and hollering. His servants are like, "What's going on? What did we do something wrong?" Right?
Yeah.
He's having a nervous breakdown before he does it. This is how much this has impacted him.
And on that point, immediately after, his brothers couldn't even answer him. They were so dismayed at his presence. And I think they were just terrified. That word dismay can mean amazed or frightened or even terrified. I think they're probably leaning on terrified. If
Yeah.
someone just had a mental breakdown in front of me, because this tension has been held for so long.
Yeah.
And the hurt is real. Like the hurt is real. Even though he's saying God is in control, he's done this amazing thing. He's even put me ahead of you to save you, but the hurt's still there. They're terrified, right? And Joseph's like, no, 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 come near to me, please. Like he calms down so immediately. He
Mhm.
calms, and all of a sudden he's the one calming them.
Yeah.
No, 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 it's okay. I really am your brother. Come near to me. Come close to me. And it reminded me, the reason I love this so much was because I would be terrified in that moment as well,
Yeah.
but also because Joseph reminds me again and again of these kind of foreshadowing of Jesus moments. And I think this might be one of them, where here you have um, Joseph who was supposed to be, they thought, probably dead. Right,
Yeah.
their intentions were not they were going to murder him, but they're like, let's sell him instead. But they probably assumed by this point, 13 years later, he's probably dead. And all of a sudden, he reveals himself to them, and they're terrified and disbelief, right? It
Right.
reminds me of when Jesus, who crucified Jesus, who they thought was dead, when Jesus reveals himself to his disciples, the disciples are also dismayed and unbelieving at that time. I think it's just a great foreshadowing.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think to Craig's point earlier about you took us further into the story, Craig, which is great, awesome, because it's all together, right? It's one story. So that Joseph, you mentioned that Joseph kind of brings this back up again, right? Hey, remember y'all sold me, but God meant it for good, right? I think it's important when you've experienced trauma, when you have some kind, if you have some kind of trauma story, um, it's important for you to, and not to dwell on it, but to not diminish it, that it did happen, right? I think it was important for Joseph, for his brothers to admit and to recognize this did happen to me. And I don't know if you guys out there watching, if you've ever been through some kind of trauma, we want to be very sensitive to that. If you've been through trauma, uh, but I'm sure you know how it feels if someone else tries to diminish that trauma, or tries to say, "Oh no, that didn't really happen," or "It wasn't that bad," that kind of thing. Sometimes people will do that just trying to help you, but it doesn't help, right? For you to tell me that what I experienced was not bad. It was bad. It's impacted me, right? So I think Joseph just wants his brothers to acknowledge, you did this to me. And you and that's a very real thing. You inflicted very real pain on me. And I don't want you can't gaslight me on that and make me
Mm.
think it didn't happen. I know it happened. But I can now also see, as bad as that was, the good that God is bringing out of it, right? Which is a huge good. Yeah, yeah, that's great. So
I,
anything else? Go ahead, Craig.
I was going to say it kind of leads in. It's a good transition or a hinge point onto my second observation for this chapter.
Yeah,
I'm centering it around verse 7, but it really plays forward throughout the rest of the chapter. And the language I hinged on was Joseph's. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant. That sense of a remnant, God using the small things in the world to move forward His purpose. We can also speak here of a sense of effective agency on the part of both the brothers and of God. But we see God's intentions in many ways overriding the brothers' intentions. He finds a way forward. But that kind of raised a question to me: can God's will be stymied and resisted? And ultimately, I think we can resist God's will. We have free agency, we have free moral agency. But in every generation, God has raised up either a remnant or the one, and ultimately be one in Jesus, who will respond to His call in faith and move forward His purposes. Especially as the Western mindset, we're very Greek in our thinking. We don't realize it, but the Greeks and the Romans wanted to abstract the gods from the earth and kind of have them separate, up on Mount Olympus or wherever. And they were kind of this holy or maybe unholy other at some points. But they wanted them to be separate from time. They recognized their divinity because they weren't conditioned and impacted and subject to time. But God, the God of the Bible, he's obviously not impacted and changed by time, but He comes into time and gets his hands dirty by interacting with us and moving His purposes forward through us, and really interacting with time itself. So one commentary said it like this: the divine plan is for God to encounter sin with real presence of His holiness in human life. And this requires a small, thin needle of a syringe rather than the baseball bat of necessary truths or global proclamations. So let's not give into the temptation to abstract away what's really happening in the Bible. God is using particular people in a particular place to accomplish His real particular will for us.
Yeah, no, that's good. He's not constrained by time, but He operates in time. He operates with us, and that really was something that the Hebrew faith brought. It was a bit different from the polytheistic cultures. Was that you have a God, as the Apostle Paul says, who sticks closer than a brother, the one that you can call Daddy, right? Abba. So that's important.
I
He's in
wanted
it.
to,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
no, you're good. I wanted to point out one more thing because I feel like we're about to move on, and I want to say one thing because I think the story, finishing this chapter with the Jacob part of the story, I think there's something here that I wanted to point out with the Jacob. Did anyone else notice how, when the brothers came and told Jacob that his son was alive, how he didn't believe them? Like how, remember how quickly he believed them that he was dead? Like immediately. He wailed and ripped his clothes off and he mourned. I mean, he immediately believed them when they said he was dead, but then he doubted them when they said that he was alive. And I just think it reminds me that sometimes it's easier to believe the bad news than the good news, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
just easier. And then I love that once he saw the wagons that came for him, I also wrote down seeing is believing, right? I believe that. Seeing, I'm from Show Me State. Seeing is believing, right? He saw the wagons, he believed. And I love what it says here. It says, it finalizes and says, it is enough. And what that reminded me of is when when Jacob, all these things happened, Jacob said, um, he said, all these things are against me in chapter 42. Remember that? All these things are against me. And here he says, it is enough. Yeah. And it's like that change in his spirit, change in his tone. Where he's like, from all things against me to it is good enough. And it reminds me that, friends, we need to be careful because weak and weary spirits can influence more by fear than by hope. And that we would rather believe bad news than good news and believe lies rather than truth. And that we just remembered if we need to stay true and know what God is in control. And that's just easier to say it is enough.
No, that's wonderful, Amber. It's a wonderful point. It's like it's so much easier sometimes, especially when you're weary or stressed,
Exactly.
to feed into the negative as opposed to the positive, to believe the negative about yourself, about other people, whatever. It's easier to believe the negative sometimes than it is to believe the positive. And that's an excellent point from the life of Jacob.
The
Great.
narrative actually uses him as Jacob when he talks about all these things are against me. And the narrative changes it to Israel when he says it is enough, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, yeah, let's move on to Matthew chapter 15, because Matthew chapter 15 is packed with some really cool stories and things that are going on. So it starts off with this, the Pharisees, and in Matthew is very specific. They're Pharisees from Jerusalem who come to Jesus, who's in Galilee, and they come to question him, to kind of check him out, and then they question him about the washing of the hands. His disciples don't wash their hands, which was the tradition of the elders. So let's start with Amber. What did you get from this particular passage?
Yeah. First of all, I was like, okay, so these guys, these Pharisees and Sadducees, they look like they're coming particularly to test him. Like they came a long ways. I looked it up. I was like, how far is Jerusalem to Galilee? Because they don't have cars. It's like over a week's long journey. Mm-hmm. So it's like, wow, they made an intention to come out. And then now when they get there, they're looking to see and test him for his, how he conforms to the law. They're looking for it. And as soon as they show up, they see the disciples not washing their hands, these ceremonial washings. And so I guess my question, Ellis, was, is that back then, I'm assuming they're looking at Jesus saying, they're not looking at the disciples and saying, why don't you wash your hands? They're looking at Jesus. He's saying, why aren't they washing their hands? And it's almost, I'm wondering was it, supposed to have in our mind that the rabbi was responsible not only for their following their disciples' theology, but also the way they live their lives, the way they conform to the law. And are they looking at Jesus and saying, Rabbi, Jesus, you should know better here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. But in first century Judaism was very much, every rabbi kind of had their own way of teaching their disciples and their own way of following the Old Testament, the Torah, which was authoritative for all of them, but they had their own approach to the Torah. It was called the rabbi's halacha, and every rabbi had their kind of own way. So Judaism didn't become solidified into one kind of teaching until the 2nd century. Some argue even the 3rd century AD. So in the time of Jesus, it was very much splintered into different kind of sects or groups of Judaism, and every rabbi kind of had their own way. And so, yes, the rabbi was held responsible. The disciples are acting a certain way, then either the rabbi didn't teach them well, taught them wrong, or he didn't have very good discipline, over them. It's like your classroom, right? So a teacher often is judged to come in my wife's a school teacher, so oftentimes administrators come in and they judge how well you're doing by how your students are behaving, right? Are you doing it well? So that very much was happening. Add to that the fact that Matthew is specific in saying that these particular Pharisees came from Jerusalem because the Pharisees were all over the place. The Pharisee was a kind of a pseudo political religious party at that time, and you found them everywhere. And unlike the Sadducees were all centered in Jerusalem. The Sadducees weren't everywhere. They were a smaller party centered in Jerusalem. Pharisees were everywhere, but these Pharisees came from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the home of the strictest kinds of Pharisees, the strictest kind of rabbis. They were very strict in Jerusalem. It was and they viewed those who were not as strict, the Galileans. They viewed the Galileans as being inferior. Period. So they were coming out to examine Jesus, but it would be like coming out and saying, "We know we're not going to find anything much good," right? Because that was just their attitude towards Galilee. They were very inferior. They were not as well educated. They were considered to be kind of country bumpkins, if you will, and they were coming out to do that. So yes, they were attacking Jesus because of the behavior of his disciples. But as it turns out, Jesus was teaching his disciples. He wasn't, right, with the whole, because he it's interesting how what he corrects, he corrects the Pharisees. I mean, he turns the table on them, right?
Yeah, he doesn't deny it. He's like, yeah, you're right. They weren't washing their hands. He doesn't deny it at all.
That's right. And you guys use the tradition to break the law yourselves, right? Craig, what did you get from this passage, Craig?
Yeah, Matthew 15, to me, Jesus is really getting to the heart of what righteous living looks like. He's either first explaining it in the first half of the chapter, and then he's demonstrating it in the second half. And here, to y'all's point that you've already made, Jesus is turning the tables on his accusers by accusing them of being the ones who are manipulating the law through the traditions. And not only that, but for their own benefit. In verses 8 and 9, Jesus quotes Isaiah 29:13 and charges the Pharisees and the scribes with hypocrisy. So it gets to a point where if they're going to manipulate the law and get away from what God is getting at with the spirit of the law, Jesus is going to call them on it. And he wants to call us back to righteous living and what the point of the law really was. So in verse 10, he comes out and says it. He's telling us it's not what comes into the body that defiles, it's what comes out of the mouth that proceeds from the heart. This is what defiles a person. And so if we're going to talk about what defiles a person, I also want to contrast it with what we need to be able to lead righteous lives. Of course, that's ultimately Jesus, and that's how we do it. But the Bible is also constantly reminding us that it comes through hearing and seeing the Word of God. It comes into Jesus's reminders constantly. He who has eyes to see and ears to hear, ... insert everything else he says here. All the times he brings it up. But to live righteously, it's clear we need the Word of God entering into us and lighting our way by sight and by hearing. We think of Matthew 6:22, the eye is a lamp of the body, corresponding to Psalm 119, 105. Thy word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And then by hearing, we get Paul in Romans 10, verse 17, saying, consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. And Jesus is not afraid to confront these Pharisees who would have been akin to religious celebrities coming to Galilee, and the disciples seem a little horrified and that Jesus is talking to these kind of, the disciples would have seen these Pharisees as being way up here. They're from Jerusalem. They have all the authority, but Jesus is not. Jesus confronts them with just as much authority, right? And so, and is not afraid to call them on what they're doing wrong. It's, tradition is great. Tradition is fine. But if it's used to break the spirit of the law, to break the spirit of Christ, if your tradition is hurting the spirit of Christ, then it's a no-brainer which one you choose. But it's interesting to me that when Jesus tells them the parable, there's two kind of like little things he does here. One is he tells the disciples it's not what goes into the mouth that makes you, or into the body, what makes you unclean is what comes out, right? And for us, we hear that and go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But the disciples couldn't see it. They couldn't fathom it. They were like, explain the parable to us. We don't get what you're saying. And he has to literally say, when food comes in your mouth, what
It goes
happens? It goes
out.
into the digestive system,
Yeah.
it goes out, right?
Exactly.
It's not it, but what comes out of your mouth, malice, anger, hatred, bad language, that reveals what's in the heart. Well, that makes perfect sense to us, but not to them. It's how tradition can really blind you, right, to the things. The other thing he says is that any plant that's not planted by God will be uprooted, right?
Mm.
And it reminded me actually of the parable of the weeds, where there's they come to him and say, "Didn't you plant good seed?" And they're talking to God. It's God's field, and he says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, what happened? Right? There are weeds." He says, "Oh, the evil one, right? Do you want us to pull it up?" No, 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 no. Don't
No,
pull
don't
them up.
touch it.
God will take care of that, right? So here you have Jesus saying, any plant that was not planted by God, the weeds, will be pulled up by God, not by you, in the end, right? So I thought that was really super interesting as well. But this is a big moment for Jesus. And then Jesus, after this moment, he goes on to this trip. I wanted to get to this. We may not have a whole lot of time left, so I wanted to get to this scene because the scene of the Canaanite woman. This one is hard for some people, right? Because Jesus seems like he's pretty harsh. Like he calls her a dog or a puppy dog, or he insinuates anyway. He puts her in this category of dogs, or some translated as he's saying puppy dogs, more like domesticated, right, pet. But it's still, he's categorizing, at the end of the day, he's categorizing the Israelites as being more important at that moment and the Gentiles being not as important. And people, of course, have a problem with that. So let's start with Craig. What did you see here?
Yeah, I'll start with a story. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had an unbeliever friend. He knew him through work, but we were discussing this passage. Just happened to come up because I guess it was one of his proof texts about why the Bible is silly. But he said he used this to say Jesus is a racist, and I kind of was taken aback. I never thought of it that way, and I looked at it and studied it, and I got to a point where is it really credible and serious to take Matthew's intent to be painting the creator of the universe, who he says Jesus is? Is it realistic and serious to think that he would paint Jesus as a racist? The second kind of point that came to mind was this is really only a question that we would ask in 21st century modern Western culture. It's really our mind that gets oversensitized to anything about race, and that's understandable given our history. But we have to take away our own context and put ourselves in the shoes or the place of the people hearing the story and understand how they would take it.
And that's excellent.
They wouldn't take it this way. They wouldn't take it as a racist commentary. They would take it as maybe him being harsh, or maybe him telling a parable or giving an analogy to do exactly what you've just said. It's I'm here for my mission, and that's Israel first, and we'll get to you later.
Yeah, and she didn't seem actually to be. She had a great comeback, first of all, but she didn't seem to be unnecessarily. She didn't take it, I don't think, as necessarily racist. Amber, how do you approach this text? I know you approached it a little differently. You've got that wonderful a feminine perspective and outside of. So what do you see here happening?
Yeah, I actually, when I read it, when Craig and I were talking about this earlier, I was shocked by how maybe offensive you even thought this was, and I was like, no, that's not what I got out of it at all. I see it as Jesus having a parable, because we just talked about parables and how confusing they can be, and how he uses language that's, you gotta kind of put the pieces together. But what I think he's doing is just painting a picture of a scene that I experience every evening. I am a parent who feeds my children. So bread, we're going to talk about bread in this scenario. That's what he uses in this parable. And I feed my children first. And I have 2 dogs, and they're there. They're there waiting their turn. And I have to remember, as a parent, they are my first responsibility. They come first. My dogs, I love them. They're my beloved pet. They're my beloved family pet. But they do not get first priority. And I think this is all that Jesus is doing. He's not calling her literally a dog. I think he's just saying you're second in line compared to my Israelite children. And that's exactly what he says to the disciples right before this. He says, they're like, Jesus, get rid of her. She's driving us crazy. And he doesn't even look at her. He stonewalls her, first of all. And he looks at them and says, don't you remember? I'm the king. I am here for the lost sheep of Israel. And basically he's saying, my focus is my people. I am the Jewish Messiah. That is to come. And I love the woman's response, Ellis, like you said, because she's like, I hear you. You're right. I am second. But can I have a little bit of that now? I know you're going to do something grand. You are the son of David. You are the Israelites' king, but I know what you're up to. Can I have some of that now? I'm in desperate. My daughter is demon possessed. She's suffering. I have nowhere else to turn. God, Jesus, can you give me some of that now? And he's like, oh, woman, you have so much faith. Let it be done. I just love it. I like this story a lot, Greg.
And he does literally say, oh, woman, right?
He literally says in Greek, it says some English translations leave it out. I don't know why, because in Greek, it literally says, oh, woman.
Yeah.
I
He's like laughing
so much more animated. When we bring it out the Greek or the Hebrew, it's like it just adds so much dimensionality to the story.
Mm-hmm.
It does. Yeah, I've always pictured Jesus in this scene after she responds with that great line, even puppy dogs deserve some crumbs from the table. I think I just see Jesus laughing and saying, great.
That's a good one.
Great comeback, right? Okay, you have faith, your daughter is healed. I think Jesus loved her comeback. I think he really did. And
not only that, it opens the doors to faith, and we see what he does in the rest of the chapter, which you pointed out earlier, Amber. So I'll let you run with that. But
no, I just wanted to say, let's not forget that Jesus knew that he was going to heal her. Yeah. And if his only mission was to only heal and bring things to the Jewish people, then he would have never healed the Roman soldier's family member, remember? And then he would have never healed, take the demons out of the two guys at the graveyard with the pigs. Remember that story? Mm-hmm. Yes, he had an intention. Yes, he was focused. But I think he was pushing this moment. I think he was drawing something. I think he knew he was going to heal her, her daughter, and he knew, and he was pulling something out of her that we're supposed to get. We're supposed to see something beautiful here. That's an intention, and Jesus knew he was going to do it, but he was pulling something, and he required his disciples to step in. It requires us, and it requires the disciples to step in for Jesus to work here.
Yeah, I think it teaches maybe a couple of things. One is that Jesus was focused, and his plan, his vision, was to bring salvation to the world through Israel. He was the Jewish Messiah, so he was building that messianic community within Israel. He knew that's the first step, and that he would send that messianic community that he was building. He would eventually empower them and send them out to save the rest of the world. So he may have been, one of the things he might have says, it's not your time yet, right? Not your time. But I love her response, and it gives us permission to say, yeah, that's great what you're going to do, Jesus, but that doesn't help me right now, right? I need help now. And if any of you have ever had, any of you guys out there have ever had struggles with your children, or your child is maybe, you have a wayward child, or a child who's making bad decisions, or a child who's in trouble. Maybe they're not even making bad decisions. Maybe they're sick, they're hurting, they're in trouble. You know that you will move heaven and earth to help them. You will do anything. You will liquidate all of your assets and go take all that money to pay for whatever it is that's going to help that child. And that's where she was. To Amber's point, as you painted the picture beautifully, she was at the end of her rope. And Jesus, this is my last resort here. This is the only thing I have left. If you say no to me, my child is dead. Right?
Yeah. So she doesn't take a no for an answer, and she's not passive. Mind you, she doesn't stay in her house and hope and pray that God sees her. She goes out to him. And then when the disciples try to shoo her away, she gets in front of him and kneels down and says, my God. Mind you, he's not the God of the Canaanites.
Right.
And she's literally saying, no, my God, my master. She's being active and not passive here for the.
And you're absolutely right, Amber. And she opens up access to him in a way. And to your point, he's wanting her to wrestle with something, and there's something he gets out of her. I think it's that sense of faith, and we read in Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, Hebrews 10:38. We find in the end that we will all, the truly righteous, will live by faith. And her faith is opening up access to the bread of heaven, which we then see the feeding of the 5,000 and the healing of the Gentiles in the land. In the rest of Matthew 15.
Absolutely. And I think it's an important point to remember that she is a Canaanite. Canaanite was the kind of the big umbrella for just anyone who wasn't Jewish in that land. but particularly she was Syrophoenician. Wasn't a great history between them and the Jews. And yet Jesus recognizes she has faith. And so you have this non-Israelite, Canaanite, kind of an enemy of Israel, who has tremendous faith. And that's an inspiration to all of us out there. Hey, we got to wrap up, guys. We got less than a minute left, but thank you for all your insight on these passages. There's a lot there, guys. Read the whole thing. That we didn't even get to the feeding of the 4,000, another great scene that ends this chapter. So I pray that God will speak to you as you read these scriptures. Stay with us every day and read those scriptures and let God speak to you through them. He's going to bless you this week through all these great stories. Ask God to give you insight, and be sure to comment in the comment section. Let us know what you're getting from this. God bless you until we see you again.